last November. Thank you, Michael. I met Michael last November. He had this free training program that he was giving out, the Scrum Fundamentals. And boy, was it so enlightening and brilliant. He used his mural board. I was like in awe looking at, thank God I felt like I had 2 monitors to go through. And, it was just very interactive session. And from there, it's been quite a journey. Thanks, Michael, and Michael is one person that I go to for anything with regards to Scrum. And if you follow him on LinkedIn, you should. He posts so many contents every day. I just can't keep up with reading all. So I have so many in my saved list that I want to go back and look at. And I try to comment, but then he has so much to offer. So if you're not, please do follow him on LinkedIn. I'm going to share all the links to that in the chat in some time. And Michael, the floor is up to you. I can go ahead and stop sharing.
Brilliant, thanks, Anu. Cool. So yeah, thanks for the intro there. I think what Anu was trying to say in a much more nice way is that I have no life and I spend all my time on LinkedIn. So yeah, no shortage of content there if you want to follow me. So for today, I will be using a Miro board. So I'm just going to chuck a link in the chat now if you want to go getting in there and making sure that you can gain access to all that kind of stuff. I will shortly share my screen though, so that you can also just follow along and see what I'm looking at. In fact, I will do that right now before I lose my train of thought. Where are we? All right, so hopefully everyone can see this, and I can see some mouse cursors popping up, so that tells me that people are managing to get in, so that's a good start. Cool. So before I get into, I guess, the meat of what I'm talking about today, you probably, if you're here, you would have seen the title, right, which is What If We Could Rewrite Scrum? So there's going to be probably a lot of contentious, thought-provoking stuff here, which is kind of what I do. It's what my aim is. But it's worth kind of giving you a bit of background as to who I am, right? So I've been an Agile coach and a Scrum Master for approaching 8 years now. I've worked in public and private sectors. I've helped dozens of teams.
Michael, sorry. I'm sorry. In the chat, people are saying that your audio is not okay.
That is not a good start. Okay. Give me a sec. Let's try changing my audio. All right, so I have changed to my laptop's microphone. Is that better or worse?
Yes, I see thumbs up.
Better.
Yes, I think we are good.
Much better.
Are you able to hear us, Mike? Now we are not able to hear you. What's a meetup without a glitch, right? As I said, I'm just posting the links, just whatever I was talking about. Feel free to connect with us. And I'm going to post the links for, yeah, go ahead, Michael, please take the floor.
Did that work? Right, sorry, I have no idea what's going on here, but am I sounding okay now though? You can hear me? Right, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, so yeah, good. Like what would it be without a bit of not being able to hear people, right? So what was I saying? Who I am, like I said, so I've been an Agile coach, been a Scrum Master for approaching 8 years, public, private sector, helped lots of people. Those of you who follow me on LinkedIn probably know that I do a lot to try and help people get a good start in Scrum Mastery and Agile coaching, because I think there's not a lot of support for people beyond those kind of 2-day introductory Scrum workshops. So that's really where a lot of my focus and energy goes. Yeah, it's 8 years is long to some, but not long to others. So the other thing worth noting is that I have a PSM3 certification from scrum.org. And I don't say that to brag. It's because I'm going to be challenging some stuff that's in the Scrum guide to get today. And one of the things that I kind of want you to trust me on is that I do kind of know the Scrum guide. I'm certainly not the world's biggest expert, and I'm sure that I still have gaps in my knowledge, but I've got a fairly strong understanding. And so hopefully you'll take my word for it when I say that any criticism that I sort of talk about today has been well thought through. But also, because I'm PSM3 certified, you can probably tell that I'm actually quite a big fan of Scrum. So I'm not here to like poop all over it and tell you that it's awful. I'm just using this as a learning experience to take a critical lens to it and see what I can get from it. So that said, we can probably get into kind of the meat of this. So the first thing you can probably see in frame 1, the question is, what's the context in which you use Scrum today? So if you're a Scrum Master or an Agile practitioner and you're using Scrum, I'd love to know if you can just drag a counter into the space to represent, do you use it in a digital software kind of producty environment, or do you use Scrum in a very unrelated, non-software, non-digital field?
And someone asked if they were able to log into the chat, log into Miro. Sorry, I think you should be able to as long as you have an account.
Yeah, I think you might need to create a guest account, but yeah, it shouldn't take too long. You should be able to just like do a Google login or that kind of thing if you can.
Right. So I just want to jump. Sorry, go ahead, Philip.
I'm so sorry. Can somebody paste that link again? Can't find it.
Sure.
Cool. I'll do that right now. Oh, yeah.
Also, Michael, would you be willing to hide the cursors? It can just make it a little bit distracting. I learned this the hard way when I do Miro presentations. Seeing everybody's cursors can make it really hard to visually focus. Thanks.
Yeah, no, someone mentioned this to me last time. It's a good trick. I have to just remind myself to do it. Thank you. Cool. So I can see some counters popping up there, right? So yeah, I think this is kind of the crux of why I started on this journey, right? So what I'm seeing here is the vast majority of people are using Scrum in some sort of a digital software delivery perspective. And the thing that I got to thinking about when like I say, trying to figure out what could make the Scrum Guide better, or what could make Scrum Practice better from the perspective of us Scrum Masters, it's, well, given that we're in software, given that the vast majority of practitioners seem to be in software, is it possible that the Scrum Guide has actually become a little bit too broad or a little bit too generalist? And that sometimes can lead us down a bit of a difficult path where we're falling in holes or hitting against anti-patterns that people have experienced before that we could call out, but that we're not calling out. And that's kind of what's led me down this path, right? So I'll scroll us down to frame 2 to kind of give you the intro to what my thought process was. So what I've basically done is started from the very first line of the Scrum Guide, and I've asked myself, if I was writing this specifically in support of software product digital delivery, rather than to be a general tool for any kind of Scrum team, what would I change in order to make it a more useful learning tool? And this very first bit of text that you can see here is my rewrite of the very first introductory line of the Scrum Guide. And you can see there what my motivation is, right? So I've mentioned here, complex digital product delivery is still the overwhelming majority of the market for Scrum. And despite this, the Scrum Guide has become quite broad to account for other work types. And I personally think there is a chance that it's become less helpful in that specific domain, which is the one in which it's most used. So like I say, my thought process is, well, what if it was written specifically to support software? How would we keep it lightweight? Because my goal is, I believe in the idea of a lightweight Scrum Guide, so I don't want to just get into explicit detail for everything that might be useful. So how do we keep it lightweight while adding just enough extra information to support this idea of digital product delivery? And most importantly, how do we do that without compromising Scrum? So my underlying goal here is to say, do, or change nothing that would actually deviate from or break the rules of Scrum. So while this is a different lens or a different way of approaching Scrum, or maybe talking about Scrum, everything here, which, like I say, as a fairly knowledgeable Scrum practitioner, should in essence still equate to good by the book Scrum practice, right? Given that Scrum is an immutable framework. To kind of put some temperance to that, this isn't actually intended to be a new version of the Scrum Guide. So as you'll see as I talk through this, and I've written it as if this is a new version of the Scrum Guide that I'm putting out into the world, but I just did that to kind of make it feel authentic. What I'm really trying to do is learn from this process and ultimately get feedback from you all who are on the call today, and maybe who else might look at this. So as we go through, please do stop me if anything doesn't sound right. If you think what I'm doing does break the rules of Scrum, if you think I'm not actually being fair to what is, written in the Scrum Guide, I really want this to be like a conversation, because we can learn. So it's not intended to replace Scrum. It's about learning, and it's about what you guys think about this process. So I guess before I get into the next kind of questiony bit, if I scroll over to the left, you can see I've actually pasted into the Miro board this entire new version of Scrum that I'm talking about. And like I say, I've taken a microscope to every line in the Scrum Guide. And what you'll see is down the middle, there's this blue track. So this is essentially the core Scrum guide. So this is in the same format and pacing, it's the same sections that are in the current Scrum guide, but potentially rewritten. So what you'll notice is that as I kind of scroll down, you'll see the top section is mostly this blue section, because what I've done there is actually changed the existing language in the Scrum guide. Whereas these purple and red sections, they represent sort of good supporting practices on the right with the purple, and potential anti-patterns to be worried about on the left with the red stuff. And so what that means is that as you go further through the guide, I'm less likely to have made specific changes to the language of the guide itself, and more likely to have added those supporting structures. And so if you're the sort of person that's a masochist that wants to read through the whole thing, it's there, you can do that, but I'm going to just pull out some selected parts for us to talk about today. So jumping over to frame 3, I'm going to ask a question, and again, I'm going to get you to just put some sticky notes on the board. Firstly, who's heard of 353, and who can tell me what that means? Who wants to kind of put some of the 353 stuff on the board? And I can see Red's got a hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Red? I can't hear anything again. Is that just me? No? Okay, maybe the hand's gone.
Yeah, it's the new Zoom version. When you raise your hand, it kind of identifies.
Yeah, okay, right. Cool, yeah, so I can see some people starting to put sticky notes on that. Oh, and I can hear my own voice. Got it. I've muted that, that's right. Oh, and was that question from Saba?
Hi. So,
hey, yeah, did you have
yes, so from what I know, it's 3 roles, 5 events, and 3 artifacts.
Yeah, nice. And I can see a few people have written that down as well. So yeah, when we talk about 353, this is a really common tool that like Scrum trainers often refer to, right? And certainly in some of the online content as like a memory tool to remember some of the core elements of Scrum. Yeah, that's basically it. And I'll tell you in a second why that's important. But I guess then the other question, which you can see on the right, which I'd love you to do the same thing for, is if I talk about the difference between professional and mechanical Scrum, and particularly anyone that's aligned with the scrum.org training, you might know this. What do we mean by the difference between professional and mechanical Scrum?
Saba? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm not sure, but I'm just going to make a wild guess. From what my understanding is, mechanical is when the Scrum Master gets into the nitty-gritties of the technical aspect of Scrum. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. And Edward, did you have a go as well?
I was wondering whether this was a difference between those that were using Scrum in places of knowledge work versus those that were more in senses of construction, like Mary Popnick's tyranny of the plan and other areas.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's not the way I've tended to think about it, but that's a really interesting thought. So yeah, and I can see a few people posting a few things on the board as well about empiricism and values. So I guess the way I think about this, and again, tell me if you think I'm missing the mark on this, anyone, but when we talk about mechanical Scrum, it's that over-reliance on the rules of Scrum and enforcing the process, which often leads to what you call zombie Scrum. I can see Mark's put that in the text. Whereas professional Scrum is about that holistic approach to understanding empiricism, living the values, and really understanding the spirit of the rules more so than just enforcing the rules themselves. Certainly how I think of it, and I'm happy to be challenged if anyone to add anything to that. But this is ultimately why I think the very first part of the Scrum Guide for me was quite a challenge when I was thinking about what good looks like. And I'm going to delete this little black box and hopefully, there we go. So when I first looked at that introduction part, the basic elements of what Scrum is in the guide, I came away thinking with my critical lens, it's actually quite mechanical. It describes a very linear flow where you have a single sprint where we start by defining some work and then we deliver some work and then we reflect and we start again. And while that is Scrum, it's not necessarily the best version of Scrum. There's no emphasis there on adapting throughout a sprint and getting, feedback throughout a sprint to change the plan. It really makes it seem like a single sprint is a one and done thing. And I think a lot of us practitioners perhaps know that that's, it's a start point, but it's not ideally what we want our end point to be. And so my next question to support that, and I can see that maybe one of my frames needs to be moved because I didn't lock it, silly me. So on frame 4, I'll do that later. On frame 4, the question is, well, how often should we release an increment in Scrum? Who wants to answer that either on the board or out loud?
We should release whenever we have something that is worth valuing and that has value immediately to our customer.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really good answer. I like that. Yeah, as often as it's ready and done. It's from Chris there. Nice. Anyone else? Yeah, whenever it's ready to provide value. Yeah, and Roger said at least once per sprint, which I like that because some of you might know that's the exact language in the guide, right? It's at least once per sprint. We should have a potentially releasable increment, I suppose, is the caveat there. And again, there's for those of us who are not so deep into the nitty-gritty of Scrum, the idea here, I think, like Edward said, is, well, it might not necessarily be worth releasing every sprint, depending on what the customer wants, but we should be aiming to have a potentially releasable increment every sprint. So if I remove this next hidden box, yeah, as often as it meets the definition of done. So this was that first line that I read in the Scrum guide that says, in a nutshell, Scrum requires a Scrum Master to foster an environment where a product owner orders the work, Scrum team turns that into an increment of value, and then we inspect the results and we adjust for the next sprint. And that's true, that's good. That would define a good Scrum team. But in my experience, really good Scrum teams want to move beyond that. And we don't want to just have a single increment in a sprint. We potentially want to have several increments in a sprint because that lowers our risk, gives us more opportunities for feedback, and allows us to just do more of that inspect and adapt stuff, which is good. And for me, while I know that that's implied in the Scrum guide, my worry is it actually clear enough? And I see a lot of teams that think that Scrum is limited to a single increment per sprint, and they don't realize that that's not necessarily the future they should be aiming for. So my question to myself was, okay, how could we make that clearer in the Scrum guide without actually fundamentally changing the rules of Scrum? And so that's where this frame 5 comes from. And so, say in that above slide, you can see the current definition of Scrum that's in the Scrum guide. And this is my attempt to rewrite it in quite a fundamentally different way, actually. I think this is the biggest change that I've made to the Scrum guide through this process. The same basic building blocks are there, right? So it's a lightweight framework. We work collaboratively, self-managing. But what I've done is, instead of focusing on the sprint as the primary kind of element of Scrum and of doing Scrum, I've changed it to the idea of a loop, a learning loop that exists between the 3 artifacts. So rather than saying it starts with a sprint and we plan some work, we deliver some work, we say, well, actually, there are 3 stages of this loop. It starts with a product backlog. That's where we explore and refine high-level ideas. Then there's a sprint backlog, where ideas are developed into working solutions. And then finally, the product increment, which is the actual testable working product that we make available to customers. And the key difference here is in that bottom line that you might be able to read that says, as ideas make their way through the triple loop, scope may be increased or decreased, they may be dropped entirely, and at every point, the artifacts are regularly inspected in order to make appropriate changes, and their outputs inform future changes. I'm sorry, Edward, I think, is your hand still up from earlier, or did you have a question?
No, I just raised my hand.
Cool.
I may be getting ahead of you, but the one thing I don't see in here is our definition of done at this point.
Yeah, cool. And partly that's because the definition of done is also not mentioned at this stage in the original Scrum guide, because we're still essentially at that in a nutshell question. And I will get to that a little bit later. But ultimately, I have not changed or removed any instance of the definition of done, because I believe it's a good, useful part of Scrum, as I think all the key elements are. Yeah,
and I believe it would fit in within the idea of working solutions.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
To be clear.
Yeah, and I guess just to add, so we're clear, I basically went through this process in a one and done fashion because I didn't want to over-engineer it and I wanted to get feedback. So this is by no means my idea of a perfect reinterpretation. So there's a lot here that I could change if I spent more time on it. But yeah, so like I said, what I've really tried to do here is I've shifted the focus away from sprints, not because I don't think sprints are useful or an important part of Scrum, But to me, it seems like they're not the core element of what makes Scrum great. The core element of what makes Scrum great is the idea of that constant feedback loop. And I would prefer the emphasis is on actually having more feedback loops rather than potentially accidentally misleading people into thinking that it's a single feedback loop in a single sprint. So by making that the core and then making the focus on the actual increments, the things that we deliver and our inspection, it's not focusing on events. And that's the reason I mentioned that 3-5-3 earlier, is because an overwhelmingly large portion of the Scrum Guide is focused on the 3-5-3, right? The accountabilities, the events, the artifacts. And to me, those are not the most important parts of Scrum. So the question is, well, why are they such a heavy element of the Scrum Guide? And again, I'll kind of just let you sit with that thought. And Mike, go on.
Yeah, so probably me, again, nitpicking, but the language that you use makes me feel like what you're concentrating on is the delivery of those increments.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether the language might be better phrased that you want to get the feedback loop. So instead of talking about what you're putting out there, it's very much more important what you're getting back. And the reason that I say that is because the artifact that you might be delivering might not be a physical artifact. It might be going and speaking to a customer and getting feedback on prototypes and stuff like that. And it's that feedback loop that's the incredibly important part.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like I say, again, this is a very principle of first, not language first approach I've taken, right? So I think that's a fair comment. I guess the thing that was in my mind as I did this is I did deliberately focus it on delivery, thinking about the software world, and that maybe that's where a lot of Scrum teams currently struggle, is they don't get to that point of we're actually delivering and getting feedback on the increment versus maybe getting feedback on our user stories or our documentation, right? Which is maybe where they currently struggle. And maybe we'll get into that in a bit more detail shortly when I get to some of the principles I've thought about. And Giorgio, go on.
Yeah, I think you touch a critical point here, in particular when we are implementing Scrum and also reporting to top management. So the reaction that I got is, so the teams are running sprints, so Scrum is implemented, but the results are not good, right? So if we change the focus to that, so it's less focused to, so they will help us to understand the values and the core of Scrum.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that certainly was part of my thinking, is if we called, or if our main view of what Scrum is was not the team is working in sprints, but rather the team is delivering regular increments and getting feedback, that to me seems like would be a better benchmark, that while still might not be perfect, would probably be a better, reality to measure against where a lot of organizations fall down. So, yeah. And Edward, sorry, go on.
Amelia raises an interesting point, and I want to expand on it. The original question is, wouldn't this just be Kanban? From my understanding, and what my understanding has consistently been, a main difference between Scrum versus Kanban. Scrum is a matter of that you are providing a restriction via the time box, which is a requirement in us focusing on events rather than increments. Kanban is a matter of items and of incremental value moving through the different points of delivery as we are going through. So if we are dropping our focus from events, how do we retain the sense of time box and thus retain the fact that this is Scrum?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things there. And again, this is where you get into the minutiae of Scrum practice that isn't called out in the guide. That's kind of what I'm trying to get people thinking about, right? So I don't want to imply there's a right or wrong answer to this, but my experience having worked with a lot of professional Scrum traders, like I say, being a PSM3, so I've had to get a really quite intricate knowledge of Scrum, is that actually Scrum is kind of expecting Kanban to a degree. I think there's a reason that Scrum.org, for example, now offers professional Scrum with Kanban training. And I think most Scrum trainers now will talk about Kanban as a complementary practice to Scrum. And I believe fundamentally that's because you should really be combining those two ideas in an ideal state. So the Scrum Guide defines the minimum. But again, if we want to move beyond that, inspect and adapt our process, eventually we should end up in some kind of flow managing state where the sprint exists as a minimum boundary for reflection rather than a maximum boundary for reflection. Now, again, your mileage may vary, the context will change how that applies, but it is exactly the sort of thing, I guess, that I'm trying to highlight with this, which is that I think the Scrum Guide largely describes a minimum process, which maybe that's fine. But one of my concerns is perhaps that there's a lot of people being sort of misled or not getting the guidance they need because they look to the Scrum Guide and think that describes a good end state rather than a start state. And Mike, go on.
So just a last thought there. Does that maybe a solution to that particular problem is having variability in your increments, or variability in your time boxes. So you can pick up a piece of work and you can say the next big feature or epic or whatever you want to call it that we want to deliver is going to take us a week this time. And so you craft your events to sort of fall within a week. And then the next thing that you want to deliver is 2 or 3 weeks. And so there can be variability in your time box, but it's still a time box. You can still have all of the events that take place in that time box.
Yeah, and you hit a really interesting point there, right? Which is at what point does it sort of, at what point is it okay to deviate from the rules of Scrum? And sometimes that's a good idea. I think some teams do grow beyond Scrum. What I've tried to do here in particular is make sure it does keep to, so it's, you know, given that Scrum is immutable, that it remains within that boundary, which is why for me, keeping the time box as a kind of conceit of managing a fixed point at which we're guaranteed to get customer feedback, for example, is useful and keeps it aligned to Scrum, but the individual work items can still, you know, relate to increments being released more frequently. And I think that's definitely something. Sorry, go on.
I'm not sure that I entirely agree. You could interpret the Scrum Guide as allowing for variable time box lengths. It just simply says the time box should be optimally between 2 and 4 weeks, but that doesn't mean that they have to be exactly the same duration every time. And so It's an adaptation rather than a total revolution.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I guess I'm trying to remember exactly the line in the 2020 guide. I know it used to say generally that you should stick with a repeatable cadence. So the reason for the sprint cadence is to make it repeatable and to lower overhead. So I think there's a idea of keeping it somewhat repeatable, but like I say, it certainly doesn't say it must remain fixed. So yeah, that's definitely within those bounds. Thanks for this. This is exactly the sort of thinking that I'm hoping to get going. So please, more of these sorts of questions in the chat would be great. That said, I'm going to need to move on to the next section to make sure we get time to talk about kind of one of my favorite bits. So I'm going to move us up to frame 6. And I'm going to ask another question. You can all put your post-its, so say it loud. What principles is Scrum based on? Nice. Empiricism comes up there. That's good. Any other thoughts? Yeah, lean. Bowman said lean. Good one. Yeah,
adaptation and transparency.
Yeah, nice. Nice, cool. I can see some good ideas. And so continue writing, feel free to keep adding stuff. But then the second question you might see there is, well, why are principles important? That's a bit more of an opinion question maybe, but I'd love to hear from you again. Chat, text, mirror board, whatever. Courage to throw ourselves in front of the oncoming train.
And ideally stop it, but yes.
Yeah, that would be a lot of courage there. So.
Disruption, I think, is probably the better way of putting that.
Nice, yeah, I like that.
Disruption with purpose.
Yeah, nice. Principles bring disciplines and cadence, act as a guiding light. I like that. Guiding light is a really good one. I think that I might have to steal that. Nice. Conflict resolution, cool. So again, feel free to keep adding stuff and we can comment on it as we go, but deleting my next little hidden box. Oh, there we go. So I'll get you to keep the stickies above this new line I've just created if you can. So what it says in Scrum, in the Scrum Guide, I should say, is this little bit of text I've put here is that Scrum is founded on empiricism and lean thinking. And then it gives you a kind of basic idea of what empiricism asserts, which I think is an interesting word, and what lean thinking is about. one of the things that I find interesting, and this is why I like that phrase of guiding light, is when I think about principles, I ultimately think about them as decision-making tools. Principles are what allow us to look at the world and without needing to just go to a rule to make a decision that's in line with that principle and is a bit adaptive and maybe answers a question that isn't explicitly answered in a rule book, for example. And Scrum doesn't actually give any of that for lean or for empiricism, right? It talks about these things and it's certainly based on these things. And I think that's good. But I think it's interesting that the Scrum Guide doesn't actually mention any of these principles or specifically what they might look like in practice. And in my experience, again, in my time doing this, most practitioners don't have a lot of knowledge of empiricism outside of Scrum and what they've learned in their Scrum course. And probably fewer still really know a lot about lean. Now, certainly there are exceptions to that, but I would say the majority of Scrum Masters that I work with don't know much about lean beyond what they learned in Scrum. And so what happens when you tell people that these principles matter without actually giving them any guidance in it? My experience is it leads to avoidable failure. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that everything needs to be spelled out, but it feels to me like taking that critical lens, this is potentially a gap in the Scrum Guide. And so what I tried to do, and again, this was me, I wrote these in 5 minutes to give an example. These are not perfect, these are not right. What I really wanted to do was to say, well, what if we actually wrote some explicit principles that aided in decision making? So rather than saying it's based on empiricism and lean, I articulated some principles that are essentially built upon lean and agile and empirical principles. And I won't read them through. Like I say, they're really just my attempt at giving an idea of what this might look like. But the line that I've put below it is the one that's important to me, which is any implementation of Scrum 4D's rules, Scrum for Digital is what I've abbreviated this to throughout, they should be considered and applied in light of these principles with respect to the spirit of the rules more so than the rules themselves. And this for me is a way of finding a middle ground between the immutability clause in the current Scrum Guide that I understand, I get why it's there, but I also think the way it's phrased, the way it's talked about, it does confuse people. And this kind of gives us a little bit more about understanding what it looks like if you have principles to follow and can deviate without fundamentally breaking the rules. And yeah, 6, optimization at the level of the system, not the individual, is potentially a good one there. Mike, go on.
Do you run into the inheritance problem? So most of us should be inheriting principles and values from, for example, the Agile Manifesto, many of which have been restated here.
Yeah.
And if you do restate them from Lean, from Kanban, Cynefin even, then as soon as they change, you've got to change yours as well.
Potentially, yeah. Like I say, again, I'm not intending to maintain this as a version. This is really a thought exercise. And I guess what I'm getting at here is, regardless of how the problem is solved, should we be thinking more closely about principles, at least in how we teach Scrum? I'm not necessarily saying that the Scrum Guide should change and include these, but I think it's interesting to know that they're absent. And I think that should enter our thinking when we actually teach Scrum to people is probably the way I would provide it.
Absolutely.
Edward, go on.
When it comes to customer value, Scrum, and because this was built in business, this is built out of a very capitalist mind frame, which means that the value is going to be the outcome that's best for that end user, no matter the costs for the individual. It's great that I can be able to receive my gummy bears from Amazon within a day, but it doesn't account for all the negative externalities that are there. Is there a means that we can be able to, in the principles, further break down the idea of customer value to be able to incorporate a sense of ethical or responsibility to a larger context and a larger scope?
Yeah, I like that. So the obvious answer is yes, right? Now it wasn't something that entered my thinking in doing this, but I've done exactly what I'm talking about, right? Which is we kind of just assume an agreement of a terminology, particularly of a principle. And I think that knowing that there are potentially other ways to articulate and to think about those problems is useful when we come to teaching, because rather than just following some prescribed approach, we can, I guess, include that thinking in part of the problem solving. So yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, sustainable pace.
I would somewhat disagree, I think. So it depends where you're going to put it. I think if you put it down in whatever repo you have, Confluence, for example, as to what ethics you have as an organization, I would agree with that, so that it can be variable between organizations. One organization may be ultra capitalistic and it's good for them, and others could be ultra environmentally friendly, and that's good for them. They don't have to have the same principles, but the underlying abstraction of you should state what your principles are might be a good abstract rule.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to put it. Yeah, I think I like that because, like you say, there's not necessarily a correct set of principles. I think for me, the part that was clearly missing when I took this critical lens to the Scrum Guide is any thought that you should articulate your principles. And like I say, I only wrote those in literally about 4 minutes, so they're not right. It's just this concept of, well, we should actually say more than just we have principles. We should talk about what they are. And so again, if you're going to talk about the Scrum Guide, I think that's worth thinking about. Nice. So moving on again, because I'm glad we're getting some good discussion, but I don't know how much of my content we're going to get through. So we'll see where we get. But the next question I've got up are, what are the Scrum values? Who can see if we can get all the Scrum values written down on this page? What do you reckon? FROC. Yeah, someone's put the acronym in the chat there. Does that help us?
Hey, Michael, I've got a quick question.
Yeah, go.
Yeah. 8. Could you? The 8 is the one that I wanted a little bit of elaboration on, because it's a pretty neat kind of point. Leadership means setting direction while supporting individuals to self-manage. Could you elaborate just a bit on that?
Yeah, so again, this was me, like I say, not necessarily picking right things, but thinking about some of the principles that I've lent on when I teach Scrum and when I coach people in using Scrum. And I was kind of leaning on turn the ship around there. It's kind of the thing that was in my head, which is, for those who don't know it, nuclear submarine captain that had to very quickly devolve control to his crew, which is a very high risk environment, and he managed to really create a bunch of leaders. For me, that's the basic principle, right? Is that effective leadership is not just about being in charge, it's about helping people understand where we're going and then encouraging them to become leaders as well. So again, whether that's a correct principle is up for you as an audience to decide, but I think that's what I tend to lean on when I teach Scrum. And so the follow-up question, now I can see we've got some values coming on there, is how do you cultivate the Scrum values? And I would love to hear if anyone wants to, maybe let's just do some post-its for this one, because I feel this could definitely turn into a big conversation. So how might we cultivate Scrum values? As in, how might we improve them or get better at them? Leading by example. Yeah, great answer. Yeah, learning events, right? You can essentially teach values, right? You can't necessarily make people have them, but you can certainly teach them. Yeah, events like sprint retrospectives, points of reflection, positive reinforcement. Nice. There's some really good examples there. And again, please keep putting those on there. I'm going to do maybe a printout or a screenshot of this at the end. So I'd love to see all the different ideas that people get. So yeah, this ultimately, again, thinking critically about the Scrum Guide was another of my thoughts. And what I realized, again, as someone who's been training people in Scrum, teaching it for a long time, is that most people leave Scrum training with probably a memorized version of the events. They could name them all because they know that that's required to pass the test often. But most people don't leave Scrum training, in my experience, with a memory and knowledge of all those values. And I've never really seen an organization that says it's implementing Scrum that explicitly goes out of its way to cultivate those Scrum values. And yes, Scrum does some stuff to kind of try to cultivate those, but it requires more than that. And most Scrum Masters that I encounter and teach, and obviously I focus primarily on people early in their career, so I have a bias there, but most people don't actually have any concrete tools. They have some high-level ideas, but they don't know how to cultivate those Scrum values. And so again, if I'm thinking critically, this was one of my first kind of supporting tracks. So what I've done is, in the Scrum Guide, alongside the list of those values, which I haven't changed the language of, I've added some examples, and I've done this for all of the values, but here is just a snippet of 2 of them, an example of what you can explicitly do to cultivate that value. So for people that don't really understand what that means, or maybe they think they understand what that value means, but they don't know, I'm trying to just give an example of what you can do. So for example, commitment is about taking personal ownership and removing impediments to success. And I explicitly call out for both of these and for the other values, a leadership example, which is, well, if you're a leader of an organization, but not a member of a Scrum team, what can you do? So for example, for fostering commitment, you could, I've lost my place. make sure that the Scrum team impediments are the highest priority for the leadership team, or demonstrate that we have equal commitment to the team's success by making their commitments, i.e. their product goal, their sprint goal, our organizational commitments. So again, these are not necessarily right ways to do this. What I'm trying to call out here is that it feels like perhaps getting a little bit more explicit to give people a bit of a flavor for what this means would potentially be useful. And again, it's grounded in those principles from before, so we can do this flexibly, right? It gives us some opportunities to decide what this might look like in our particular context. So scrolling over frame 9, what are the accountabilities of a Scrum team? Does anyone want to put some post-its on there? Or again, in the chat. Yeah, I love it. So immediately, oh, go on, sorry, Anna.
Mike, yeah, I was just saying we are at the 11-minute timer. We have a hard stop at 1, just to let you know.
Cool. Yeah, so we're probably not going to get through all my content. So what I might do after this section is I'll do a bit of a reveal all, and we'll just have a bit of a chat, perhaps. So yeah, one of the first confusions that immediately pops up here since the 2020 changes to the Scrum Guide, some of you might know the roles were changed to accountabilities. So there are accountabilities in terms of Scrum Master, product owner, developers, but there are also accountabilities in terms of the things we are accountable for. And I think that these are often a little bit misunderstood. And so I'm going to unlock these. And I'm going to ask a quick question. Basically, just give me maybe a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Do you think that the way that a Scrum team is described in the Scrum Guide is a good description? Does it sound like a good team? What do you guys think? Yes or no?
It's tautological.
Maybe, but I'm asking for your opinion, I guess. Is like, do you think that the description in the Scrum Guide sounds like a team that you would like to work in or with? No one wants to go first, do they?
It's pretty generic.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So I guess let me give you my opinion, because I don't want to put anyone too much on the spot. My opinion is that, yeah, it kind of does. It sounds, it doesn't say much, but I think if a team did do all of the things mentioned in the Scrum Guide, they'd probably be a good Scrum team. But that's why my second question there is, well, how many teams actually look like that? Because in my experience, it's not a lot, actually. Most Scrum teams that I work with, I don't think could actually be described as Scrum teams, if we were being really honest. And I've worked with a lot, to be fair. And so again, this is where this idea of calling out anti-patterns comes from. So what I've done down that red track is call out some of those things that regularly catch teams out. So for example, a team of siloed specialists. So it is okay to have specialists in a Scrum team, right? So developers could mean someone with a specialism in business analysis or a specialism in testing. That's totally fine. What we don't want is a mini waterfall inside our Scrum team where things just get handed from one person to another. Most of us know that, but again, it's not called out in the Scrum Guide. So to me, that becomes potentially a place that we could make things clearer for people. And the same goes with externally dependent skills. If you're a Scrum team, but you've got an external test team that has to test everything before it can be released, you're not really a Scrum team. A lot of us probably know this, but again, it's not in the guide. And a lot of teams that I encounter don't even realize that that behavior is essentially against the core of the idea of Scrum. And Giorgio, go on.
Yeah, so what I think is, I'm not in the IT industry, and most of the language that we have in the guide is related in the, not the language itself, but the way that it's described is focused on the IT industry. And for me, not having the specialists in the team, for instance, I'm in R&D for agriculture technology. So it's difficult that we apply, the same rules that you see in the guide now for the team and make them understand.
Yeah,
so we have to have a specialist in some situation.
Yeah, and again, I don't think having specialists is bad, but there's this idea of a cross-functional team, right? That's the language that's in the Scrum Guide, which is that a specialist shouldn't be siloed. We should all be learning from each other and knowing a little bit about what we all do so we can all contribute. I think that's a good thing. But again, I think a lot of teams are a long way from that and don't realize that it's a future that they should be aiming for. And so I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I guess just to get to the wrap up, of this concept. I've done this throughout, and again, you can read that whole version on the left if you want to, is I've tried to just put a little bit of a flavor for real practice in these anti-patterns, calling out things that we tend to know are dysfunctional. So later on, for example, I call out things like an overuse on velocity and using that as a planning tool. A lot of us know that that's bad practice, but a lot of organizations, a lot of high level, let's say leaders, or perhaps just less experienced Scrum practitioners don't know that that's a dysfunctional practice, and they do it thinking that it's expected of them. So again, I think that just doing a little bit more of that call out would go a long way. And so I won't go into the detail now of everything else I've posted. I'd invite you to read that whole guide. Message me on LinkedIn if you ever want to have a chat about it. My basic premise here is I still think the Scrum Guide is good. And I still think that Scrum as a framework is great. I think it is a brilliant tool for a lot of teams, but I'm not sure that the Scrum Guide in its current format is the best way to teach Scrum to people specifically in that software domain. And so I think if some minor changes aren't made, which they probably won't be, certainly not in line with what I think they should be, we should consider strongly how that difference, how that lack of clarity in the Scrum Guide needs to be augmented by our knowledge, what we teach to people, and the practice that we guide people towards. So again, I'm not saying the Scrum Guide is bad. I'm just saying that a fairly critical view to me brings some potentially high level challenges that people will fall into if you don't guide them. So that's why it's important that we as Scrum practitioners go through and guide people, right? That's why we're there, and we have to take that very, very seriously. So I know I'm really, really short on time. So thank you. That's because we've got some really awesome questions, and I would love to do a follow-up session at some point. Again, feel free to message me anytime. And I guess we'll leave that last 5 minutes if anyone's got any last thoughts or questions. And I'm sorry for not leaving us more time for that.
Follow up next week, where we can cover the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I could just hijack Smotu, but I could definitely book something on the side. So maybe follow me on LinkedIn, and I'll post something in my own on my own that anyone that is welcome to come to. So yeah, I'll have a think about that for sure. Cool. And so sorry, just before I go to the questions, I will just quickly add, because I need to do it today. Some of you may know that I'm also the creator of Dysfunction Mapping, a tool to help Scrum Masters get better at solving problems and helping people. I have a workshop coming up next month on the 10th, and there are tickets still available for that. There is a link here on the Miro board, and I'll get Annie to chuck the link in the chat as well. So if you're interested in coming to that, please follow that link or connect with me on LinkedIn and have a chat. But Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, my biggest bugbear from the Scrum Guide specifically is the immutability rule.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, the idea that you shouldn't be adapting the framework itself, to me, seems ridiculous.
Yeah, and so there's, again, I don't expect everyone to go and read the whole thing, but one of the lines that I put in there is after, I think, the principles that said, I think I mentioned it. So the idea is, rather than saying it's immutable, I put a line in there somewhere that says things will get harder before they get easier, because you're using a tool that's going to increase transparency. So rather than bending the rules too early, instead try to push through the pain and see if you can find a better way, either from these supporting tracks that I've created or from other practice. To me, that's a good balance between the idea of immutability, but not just letting people change the rules as soon as things get hard. But again, there are many different approaches or thoughts to this.
And what's very interesting, I can't remember if this is in the PSM1 or PSM2, but there's direct questions that say, why don't we change the Scrum Guide? And it's not a matter of saying that no one ever shall. This is not a biblical reference or dogmatic reference. It's a matter of, well, at that point, then the organization needs to be able to translate what their new roles and new goals and new guides are. And if you are moving away from it, then you need full transparency and communication across the entire spectrum. So that immutability, I don't know if the current Scrum Guide addresses it. I have to go back and really read it line by line. But that was always something that, at least in the testing, to be able to be certified through scrum.org, it accounted for as it's not necessarily immutable so much as there are problems if one does go ahead and change it.
Yeah, fundamentally what it says, is you can change it all you want, just don't call it Scrum anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous, because you're fundamentally doing Scrum, even if you don't change a comma or a full stop. It seems like a ridiculous standard. And the other thing is they say inspect and adapt. Well, the other thing is they encourage inspect and adapt, but they say don't inspect and adapt us. And the other thing is there are versions of the Scrum Guide. So even they've changed the framework as time has gone on. So surely we should be encouraged to do so with all of the caveats that Michael says. You really need to understand the impact of the change. Otherwise, you really can go into the wilderness.
Well,
I think
on
there's
that note,
Okay.
I'm sorry, guys, because I know Anu said that we have to have a hard stop in a couple of minutes. So perhaps should I throw back to you, Anu, and what I would love to do for anyone that wants to continue this conversation, connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not already, and I will arrange something in the next week or so, and we can have a follow-up chat with whoever's interested.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. We will see if we can bring in Michael again for another session. The registration for his dysfunction mapping workshop that's coming up is on the chat, and the link to connect him with him in LinkedIn is also there in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us. You can always reach out to us in all the areas. You can reach out to us in LinkedIn as well, and for Smoto. And thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it. And this was a very enlightening session. I liked how interactive it was, right? I mean, all the gurus that someone said it there, all the Scrum gurus out here, they were all just having a very interactive session, and I just loved it. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.
And I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.
Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Everyone.
Great day.
Bye. Thank you.
We lost Mike. I was gonna say his stance was kind of that the open gaming it's a lot like the open gaming license, and someone doing homebrew and D&D, it's still based in the open gaming license, much like that Scrum